J'ai l'honneur de donner l'introduction pour cette conférence. Et je veux aussi, bien sûr, remercier Chris Salter et Gisèle Trudel et l'organisation de Hexagram, ainsi que DHC et Cheryl Sim pour nous donner l'opportunité d'inviter JOAN JONAS ce soir. I will continue in English for the introduction for Joan, so she also hears what I understands what we're saying. I'd like to, can you hear? No, louder? Okay. I'd like to begin by thanking everyone for being here tonight. I'd also like to thank the organizers of Recreate, of course, and congratulate to a great start today of the conference of the Media Art History 2015. This conference will continue over the next couple of days. Tonight's keynote will be presented by JOAN JONAS. And I'd like to also thank DHC and particularly Cheryl Sim for making this event possible, and of course the directors of Hexagram, Gisèle Trudel and Chris Salter. The next 2 days there will be 2 more keynote addresses that I warmly recommend that you see. There will be Christine Van Asch tomorrow at 11 a.m. at the Agora, UQAM Agora. And on Saturday, there will be Scavanati also at 11 a.m. at the UQAM Agora. So I hope to see everybody there. For tonight, I would like to briefly introduce JOAN JONAS. It's really with a great pleasure. As an art historian and curator, I've been engaged in her work, with her work, for the last almost 15 years. And what 15 years ago in the late 90s, what made Jonas's work so particular and special was really that she has remained on the forefront of the visual arts all this time since the late 60s, at the moment when she embarked on a lifelong journey to visualize processes of time as artistic materials through various mediums. Throughout her career, she has worked with various media, with a dedication to find new ways to approach the audience. Her work has been exhibited extensively across the globe. The last big exhibition, there was not only in Malmö a retrospective in Sweden, but especially for the representation of the US at the Venice Biennale. This installation will close in a few days in November. But her work really started in the late 60s when she really started to find out new ways for, as she said, to give up making sculpture and to walk into space. It was particularly not only her engagement with new media at the time, or interests in the new media of video, but also her knowledge and passion for research, specifically for art history, poetry, literature, history, and cinema. And for her travels that brought her from Cape Breton in Canada to Mexico, from Japan to Iceland, all over the world, which allowed her to weave together various stories and inspiration and sources. And this is something that has been really present in JOAN JONAS's work, and that's the idea of a rich layering of different themes and interests. And it's really this dedication to explore, specifically to not only tell stories, but to create stories that are told in a non-linear way, that question also the power structures behind narratives and the way we see and understand the world around us. So what was emblematic for her work is still this idea of not only pioneering with the mediums and forms of expressions engaged in performance-based practices, but also new media-based practices, but also the choice to really question the world around us, as well as how identity and representation constructs itself. In this sense, her work remains to speak to us actively until today, and will continue to speak to us today. And what we will see tonight is a wonderful overview over her entire work, her entire process, which will also make clear the different narrative threads that have run through her work. I would also like to say that we will have a period of question and answers after her presentation and talk, and I hope that you will participate in this question and answer period. There is also another announcement that JOAN JONAS will be showing her work in the future in Montreal at DHC this spring. DHC in this case is really a partner of also this event these weeks. There's, by the way, also an opening tomorrow night at DHC for art from Brazil. And in that sense, so many things going on. I would like to welcome you again, and I'd especially like to welcome JOAN JONAS and thank her for being here and coming.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you to everyone who organized this and who are responsible for inviting me, mainly Barbara. And I'm very happy to be in Canada. Maybe some of you know that I've spent a lot of time here in my life, and a lot of my work owes a lot to Canada. Not Montreal, but Cape Breton. So I'd like to begin by reading a statement. I'm not sure now that there's enough light. Maybe we could turn the light up a little bit, just a little bit. And I'm going to very quickly trace ideas that I began with, that I developed in my work, thank you, in my work at the very beginning from '68 on, because those ideas run through my work to the present. And I won't repeat these, I won't make reference to these ideas again, but you can see them throughout the work until the present. And I also want to make a brief statement about the subject of this conference is research. When I began my work, I studied art history and sculpture. And research, of course, has always, for time immemorial, has been part of the development and process of anybody studying or making anything. Research is just it goes without saying. It's part of the process. And so the work that I did as studying art history, the various influences on my work include art history, sculpture, literature, poetry, and looking at art history, looking at painting, and reading literature, reading poetry. Myth is a constant throughout those forms, and in relation to that, ritual, and in ritual is the beginning of art. So from the very beginning, I looked at all these things, and they became a part of my practice, because when I began to make performances, I wasn't satisfied with my sculpture. And so when I stepped into the space of sculpture, the three-dimensional space of performance, rather, I was able to add other elements such as sound, such as text, other ideas to the work that I couldn't at that time in the '60s include in sculptural objects. The literary influences include, at the very beginning, particularly James Joyce, Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and that's where myth is used in a very specific way to represent one of the characters. And then when I began to think about when I began my mirror works, before I began my mirror works, the short stories of Borges were translated into English, and I read them, and they had a huge influence on me. So for my first mirror piece, I copied out all the quotes about mirrors from Borges, and they were particularly interesting because they express his ideas about mirrors being somehow mysterious, threatening, and all kinds of other things that we don't think about. I also liked mirrors because I liked the way mirrors in the performances made the audience uneasy and also brought the audience into the performance. So I'm going to read a statement I made in the late 70s, early 80s for a catalog, and it explains how I looked at this overlapping of the different mediums and how I felt about stepping from sculpture into performance, and also bringing together all these different mediums. I didn't see a major difference between a poem, a sculpture, a film, or a dance. A gesture has for me the same weight as a drawing. Draw, erase, memory erased. While I was studying art history, I looked carefully at the space of paintings, films, and sculpture, how illusions are created within the frame space, and how to deal with a real physical space with depth and distance. When I switched from sculpture to performance, I just went to a space and looked at it. I would imagine how it would look to an audience, what they would be looking at. How they would perceive the ambiguities and illusions of the space. An idea for a piece would come from just looking until my vision blurred. I also began with a prop, such as a mirror, a cone, a TV, a story. This is a recreation of my early performances, mirror pieces they were called. There were two, Mirror Piece 1 and Mirror Piece 2, 1969 and 1970, or a year earlier. And you can see they were very formal, and they involved 17 performers carrying mirrors and performing very choreographed movements. First passing in front of the audience with the mirrors, and then performing various patterns. And I was interested in how the mirrors broke up the space in a cubist way, how the mirrors reflected the performers, the space itself, and how they created a surface that one after one looked at these mirrors moving in space, perceived. The woman on the floor was originally myself. I had no experience in performance, so in these early works, I did very simple things. In this case, I was carried around in this stiff position, like a board, by the two men who are in the piece. This is a piece called Wind, which, 1968, was the first film I made, and Peter Campus was the cameraman. As you can see, the performers have mirror costumes on, and that was actually the first time I used mirrors on the costumes. This is a really conscious relation to ritual, and again, the movements are very simple. In the 70s, another, of course, big influence, and one of the reasons I had the idea even to switch from what I was doing to performance-based work was seeing the work of the people who are doing happenings, Klaus Oldenburg, Robert Whitman, and then dancers, Lucinda Childs, Yvonne Rainer. And I saw this work and I immediately thought, that's what I want to do. And so I was drawn into it without thinking, actually. I was just simply could not stay out of it. So I took several years to make that transition. And this was my first film. And it's called Wind, and it was based on an indoor piece. And it was the coldest day of the year on Long Island, the shore of Long Island. And the camera actually froze, which affected the way the film looks. One theme, this is another piece called Song Delay. And it was, so these outdoor works, first there were the mirror works, and then the outdoor works. And I was interested from the very beginning of how the image exists. What is the image? How do we make the image? And how can I alter the image? So in the outdoor works, this is an image from a performance on the Lower West Side, or actually from a film I made called Delay, Delay, based on that performance. In the outdoor works, the performances take place a distance from the audience, far enough away, so that the image is flattened. Parallel lines are seen as flat, not parallel lines, diagonal lines are flattened into parallel lines. And in particular, the sound delay. So this is called song delay. And this is made with a telephoto lens in this case. In order to translate the performance into a film, we use two different lenses, a wide angle and a telephoto. A regular lens, you wouldn't be able to see what was going on in the distance. But this is the real sound delay that was going on. And it was filmed on the Lower West Side when it was just empty lots in 1970. And the ships went by at odd moments, and that's just a serendipity that happened, which was, amazing. Another theme that I'll mention is the idea of, throughout the work, the idea of inside and outside. And it's hard for me to explain it, but by inside, I mean the work comes from inside of me. It comes from my own sensibility, my aesthetic, all of that. And it also is, in a way, personal, but not in an autobiographical way. By outside, I mean that I always think about what's going on in the world around me. And I'm very much aware, of course, as we all are, of what's going on. And so in the case of, this is a piece called Organic Honey. And I'll just read you a little bit about this series. I consider Organic Honey to be one project with variations. The first version being Organic Honey's visual telepathy, the final version, Organic Honey's vertical roll. This is the way I work between the performances, visual telepathy, and vertical roll. I made the vertical roll at the Ace Gallery where I had the performance, Ace Gallery in LA. I inserted actions from the tape into the performance, but I did not include the tape itself in the performance. Actions from the tape were performed live. I am interested in developing and altering work from place to place. From night to night, I initially perform the same actions, but when I move to another location, I take the opportunity to add, subtract, reconfigure. Basically, I consider this a unit, and this is true of the way I work on all my projects. That's changed a little bit because my work has become more elaborate, and I'll talk about that later. I reach a point where the piece more or less remains the same after a certain point, but there is a constant going back and forth between the performance, the installation, single channel works, and there's an exchange of information continuously because I discover things in each of those mediums. To me, okay, that's a drawing. So the Organic Honey pieces, the main idea behind the Organic Honey was altering the image through the circuit of the live TV closed circuit system between the camera, the action, and the projection or the monitor. In this case, you see a monitor and a projection, a live projection. So the audience sees simultaneously a live projection with the live performance. And there are also pre-recorded tapes included and so on. So there's a double time experience. You see the time in the video projection as well as the time in the live performance. And it complicates the situation quite a bit. These early works were it was not about storytelling, but I was involved with the subject of, is there such a thing as female imagery, which was had a direct relationship to what was going on at the time, questioning the place of women and also women's liberation. And that was a very important question for all of us at the time, men and women, actually. It affected everybody. And there was a lot of anger, there was a lot of energy generated by that movement. And I think of course, it's still going on, but in a very different way. Then it was at the forefront. And this piece related to that in subject matter and content. And the idea was that I created disguises for myself and altered my persona and dealt with an alter ego, I called it, or another persona called Organic Honey. I had been to Japan in 1970. I was very influenced. Travel is another big influence on my work. And so this trip to Japan, I saw a lot of no drama and kabuki. And I began to use masks in the outdoor pieces and particularly in the Organic Honey piece. And the reason I was so drawn to the No Theater was because it's a visual dance. It's a theater that is a visual dance theater. And for somebody who doesn't understand Japanese, it's very abstract. And it's an incredible form. Also the Bunraku puppet theater, which I saw later on. So these are different images from the Organic Honey performance. I incorporated drawing of dogs into my work. And in this piece, there was a camerawoman who was part of the performance who actually, I directed all the camera work, and I was watching a monitor at the same time that I was performing. And I bought costumes and objects. And at the same time, like in 1994, later, I'm skipping there, I had a show in the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam where it was a retrospective. And that was when I really began to concentrate on translating my performances, my live performances, into installations. And I was able to do that because I had made autonomous videotapes in relation to many of the elements. And I showed all the videotapes that were involved in this piece, and the costumes, the props, and the objects. And I made a kind of what I thought of as a stage set. I included dogs in my piece. The way I justified that was I thought that dogs and animals, from my research into ritual of other cultures and ritual from this culture going back to the Greeks and the Romans and so on, the animal helper. So it's either a horse, a cat. In my case, it was a dog. So I included the dog in this work. It was a very important image. And I drew the dog over and over again. This is another version of the installation in another show, different show. Okay, I'm just going to read something about drawing. Because I began to draw, I draw all through my work. It's one of the things that I've continued to do since studying art, studying sculpture and drawing. I wanted to continue to do one of the practices in a very serious way. Also, I think of my stage sets as kind of as sculpture, actually, but of another sort at that time. To perform a drawing in public adds a psychological aspect, what it means to be watched. The drawing takes on another meaning because I am in the moment. Although I rehearse making the drawings, I am not directly thinking about the drawing because I am performing, always aware of the audience and the space of the piece. I am not thinking of making a good drawing. I am performing while looking at the monitor of a large or a large piece of paper on the floor. I don't treat these drawings as precious objects. They may be tossed or thrown to the side or crumpled into condensed balls with my body. Some of these drawings exist in my installations or are used in other parts of my work. Many are saved. So video allowed me to do a drawing for the camera so that the audience would see a small drawing. And also, I began to think of different ways to draw in all the pieces. One of the ways I draw is, one of the disciplines is draw without looking, for instance. That was one of the things I do. All right. In the late 70s, I began to work with fairy tales. So this is the next medium, in a sense, the text, the story. And I began to make stories. I began with the Grimm Brothers fairy tale, The Juniper Tree. A friend of mine who's a poet, Susan Howe, her son, this was her son's favorite poem. And this is the first version of that in Philadelphia, and it was a performance for children, which was one of the most challenging things I had done so far, because children are an unforgiving audience. But they were kind of transfixed, and at the beginning of the performance, their mothers came up to me because they read the story. It's a very brutal story. And luckily, I was able to say that Bruno Bettelheim had just written Uses of Enchantment, in which he explains that fairy tales are good for children. It enables them to imagine getting through difficult situations, very scary situations, but they always end up in a good place. So that was interesting. So I began, in relation to the Juniper Tree, when I work with stories, I really analyze them and I pull them apart. These are different performances. I made different versions of this. This was in my loft. And this was in the Whitechapel Gallery in London. I researched the story, I take it apart, I analyze, for instance, in this story, the colors were red and white. And then I traced it. You could trace this story. It's about a good mother and a bad mother. The bad mother kills the little boy and serves it up to the father as a stew. And then the little girl gathers all the bones together and goes out to the juniper tree, and a beautiful bird is born. And the little boy comes back, of course. But I traced it all the way back to the myth of Osiris in Egypt, because all of these stories I found come across Northern Europe, and they pass from one culture to another. And I always find this interesting because I'm interested in how different cultures affect each other and how I am influenced by other cultures. So this piece turned into this installation. These are paintings I made in the performance, and then they became part of the installation. This is a piece called Mirage, and I won't say very much about it, but after dealing with the roles that women play in the fairy tales in the early Organic Honey, I made a piece called Mirage after a visit to India, another place that had a big effect on me. And Mirage was much more abstract. It was a black and white video piece, and I made it in the Anthology Film Archives. Here it is. I'm very interested in working with the space, and the Anthology had a projection screen that changed size and shape, and so I used that as a device to make different scenes. So I worked with a screen, and it changed its size and shape during the performance. Also, I began earlier than this to use cones as a form, and I become interested in a form and what I can do with it. So here I'm sitting on top of the TV. So this was the last, for this time, it was my last piece with video where I explored, as far as I could at that time, all the different ways of the relation of performance to video, to the monitor, to the space, to movement. Movement is something that I'm not a trained dancer, but just to make it short, I mean, in certain cultures, everybody dances. Like in Cape Breton, for instance, there are things called dances that we go to. You could go every night to a dance, but it's a square dance, or it's step dancing. I can't do that, but everybody can do these dances, and I think that's the way I think of myself in relation to my piece. So I develop my movement pieces by improvising with props and objects, and I think of them as a kind of language, the way drawing is a language. The movements are a language that convey a kind of content of the piece. For instance, running in front of the volcano, exploding. In this case, I'm making various gestures, variety of gestures. This is an installation of that piece. So throughout the work also, there's a going back and forth, and sometimes I begin with the performance, and then it's translated into an installation. Sometimes I begin with the installation, it's translated into a performance. The Mirage went through several different transformations, which I won't go into tonight, but this is the latest version, and at some point I stop changing these pieces, especially if a museum acquires them, then it definitely stops. I stop changing them. Although the show in Malmo that Barbara mentioned, it's arranged slightly differently than it is usually because of the space. This is a piece called Volcano Saga, and this really began with a friend of mine telling me how beautiful the Icelandic sagas were. I was interested in exploring different literary forms, and so I thought the sagas are almost like a precursor of the novel. And so I actually went to Iceland. I got a grant, and I called up Stena Veselka, my friend, who's a video artist, and she was going to Iceland at the same time. So both of us, I went and I met her in Iceland, and she was driving around with a young filmmaker from Belgrade or someplace. And we drove all along the south coast, and I began to, research the material while I was there at that time. I read as many sagas that are as possible that are translated, and we explored the landscape as much as possible. I did. I mean, it's an enormous country in that way and hard to drive around, but it's amazing places, some of you must know. And the landscape itself is like a character because it's the closest to the center of the earth. It's closest to the hot center, and it's erupting all the time, and also all the hot water they have, it comes from the hot springs, and so on. And so this is the performance. It had 2 video projections in the middle there, and 1 slide projection. The red square was where I showed slides that I'd taken in Iceland. This is another image from the performance. I'm going to show you a short clip from the video that developed out of this piece, and it involves actors. I started using actors a little before this, but I think you'll recognize Tilda Swinton and Ron Vaughter, who is a member of the Worcester group. And also I'll say that all the actors I've used or the performers, they're always friends or friends of friends. So I don't go out and look for people. I rely on my community. What time is it? How much time?
And 4 of them in particular disturbed me greatly. No one has understood them to my satisfaction. But I'm not just asking for a pleasing interpretation.
Tell me your dreams. And maybe I can make something of them.
I dreamt I was standing outside near a stream. I was wearing a headdress on my head, but I felt that it didn't become me, so I was anxious to change it. A lot of people warned me not to, but I paid no attention to them, and tore the headdress off my head and threw it into the stream. And that was the end of that dream.
So, this is another piece. So one of the things another element that links the works one after another, Iceland is an island, and this is a piece that was based on a piece called Sweeney, Astray. It's an epic Irish poem, and I won't talk about it very much, but I'll just say that I became interested in that part of the world, and also because Cape Breton, I've been going to Cape Breton this summer since 1970. And when I went to Iceland to look at the site for the Laxidella saga, which is the saga that I based the Volcano Saga on, the place where that took place looked exactly like where I come from in Cape Breton. And so that is actually the personal draw, that I feel very close to some of these landscapes. I identify emotionally with them. And also, when I went to Cape Breton for the first time, I was immediately drawn into the culture and to all the superstitions and stories and the rituals. So this piece, based on Sweeney Astray, is about a king who goes mad in battle. So I began to think about war and the effect that war has on us. And so this is a myth. He goes mad because of war. And there's other stories like that from the Irish tradition. Lines in the Sand. I'm going to now talk about my latest body of work that began in about, I guess, 2003. And they're kind of related, these 4 pieces. I'm not talking about all of them, but they're related because, well, Lines in the Sand was, I had dealt with epic poetry. Actually, I was asked to be in Documenta, and Okwe Enwezor came and said, why don't you, in this case, I hardly ever am assigned like this, but why don't you do a piece based on an epic poem? So I chose Helen in Egypt, a 300-page poem by Hilda Doolittle. And Hilda Doolittle is a poet who when I took a course in poetry at Columbia in the 60s, she was one of the poets that I really identified with. She was a part of a group called the Images. And it's a very simple, Images, it's based on the idea of the haiku. It's very simple language, and it has to do with an image, which why it was interested me. And Hilda Doolittle was a very fascinating, eccentric character, and flamboyant and wonderful. And I was interested in the Helen in Egypt because, again, it relates to war a little bit. It's taking the story of Helen of Troy and saying that she never went to Troy, she went to Egypt instead. It's not a new story. It's a Greek story from, BC 400 or something. And she went to Egypt, and therefore she never went to Troy, and the Trojan War was fought for an illusion. So there's a kind of feminist subtext, which is that they blame the woman for the war, and that was part of my thinking. Usually I did for a long time play the characters of in these pieces, in the performances. And I've gradually stopped playing these characters in the same way. And especially Helen, I didn't think that I didn't want to represent Helen. And so this is the stage set that I made for the Documenta piece. This is actually the couch is based on a Cape Breton kitchen couch. Some of you, I'm sure, know that in the kitchens in Cape Breton and also in Newfoundland, the men make couches that they can lie down on when they come in from fishing and actually watch the women cook or whatever. And so I based this because then it became, I used it before this on something else. And then I looked at it and it looked like an Egyptian couch also. And also a psychoanalytic couch because H.D. also wrote Tribute to Freud based on her analysis that she had with Freud in the 30s, which interested me a great deal. It's beautiful. And so I intercut the poetry with these prose passages from Tribute to Freud because her poetry is very flowery sometimes. And I liked the contrast also. I was born in 1936, and so I identify a little bit with the 30s and the fact that war was, brewing in the 30s. And I felt when I started this piece that there was somewhat the same situation that we were in. This was in 2000. Well, it was before 9/11, and actually, strangely enough, 9/11 happened the summer that I was reading this poem, and it was of course, very upsetting for all of us, and I couldn't work on it for a few months, but it did happen at that time. And it was strange because the newspaper articles all referred to things like the Trojan horse and so on as a metaphor for what happened. This is part of an installation. There was a sandbox. Oh, this is part of the performance. At the kitchen after the installation. So I worked with one of my ex-students, Ragini Haas, for many years. And in a way, I was developing a double. Somebody who could perform with me and also be autonomous. Because I would show her what I would want her to do, and she would do it in her own way. So in order to develop this piece, I really entered into I entered in the spirit of HD. I don't know why it's happening. Is there another mic on or something? I'll wait till this stops. We entered into the spirit of HD, and in a way channeled her, but not in an illustrative way. My work is not illustrative. It's not an illustration of the text ever. It's a representation of the text. And the visual track and the track of the text exist side by side and have a relation to each other, but I'm not interested in illustration. Okay, I'm going to stop this. Wait a minute. I'll go back to that. I'm just going to read the next. So what you heard me just say, The Shape, the Scent, the Feel of Things, became the title of the next piece called The Shape, the Scent, the Feel of Things, which was commissioned by Dia Beacon and developed and made in the basement of Dia Beacon. But I spent several years before that part of it doing a lot of research about the subject. In the 60s, it's a revisiting of one of my early experience. Just like in The Lines in the Sand, I used photographs of Egypt that my grandmother took when she went there in the very early part of the century, the first years of the last century. And in Lines in the Sand, we represented Egypt in another way by going to Las Vegas, where there's a casino called Luxor. And I found many images in Las Vegas of discarded, statues from the casino and so on. And I liked this reference to America. And the desert became the Egyptian desert and so on. Also, the beach in Cape Breton becomes the Egyptian desert and also the Southwest and so on. So sand can represent any place in the world in a way. And Lines in the Sand refers to the fact that the borders of all these countries in that area of the world were drawn not by the people who live there, but by people like the British and so on. I'll just read a piece about the shape, the scent, and the feel of things. This project goes back to a journey I made 40 years ago to the Southwest, where I had the opportunity to see several Hopi rituals, including a performance of the Hopi snake dance. Although I have never used it in performance, this very special experience has inspired my work ever since. About 10 years ago, I came across a reference to the dance in an essay by the German art historian Abby Warburg in Images from the Region of the Pueblo Indians of North America, translated and with an interpretive essay by Michael P. Steinberg. In his investigations, Warburg used photographs of artworks in his previous investigations from different cultures, across different cultures, recombined and cross-references to produce a display, for example, of certain gestures as portrayed by Greeks, Romans, Indians, and so on. He made many such displays on boards dealing with various themes. He similarly recombined the placement of books in his library, an action that evoked the different relations between their subjects. Though Warburg's trip to the Southwest, which profoundly altered his view of art history, took place at the end of the 19th century, he did not produce his famous text about his experience there until 30 years later, as he was recovering from a mental breakdown at a sanitarium in Switzerland. He wrote it as a cure, or proof of one, to himself as much as to his physicians. Although he did see certain dances and rituals, Warburg never saw the Hopi snake dance, but I was struck by his descriptions of it and by the depth of his concern with the culture. Many people, including myself, considering the true plight of Native Americans, find Warburg's views of his experiences to be problematic. As far as I know, he didn't mention the tragic situation of how they were being pushed off their lands and deprived of their culture, the very culture he was so passionate about. I made another trip to the Southwest in January 2004 with a project like this specifically in mind. I stayed on the Hopi reservation and began a dialogue with people in the community, but I did not wish to impose upon or take away from the Native American people. I decided instead to return to Warburg's writing. For instance, I found myself focused on Durer's Melancholia, reproduced in Steinberg's essay in the Warburg volume. To me, Melancholia evokes memories of the European presence as it impacted the American landscape. And I will show you a clip from that performance at Dia Beacon. And there are several performers. And this is when I began to work with Jason Moran, the jazz composer, Jason Moran. I met him, and Adam Pendleton told me about him. And so I called him up, and I told him, and he was immediately interested. And so we were very lucky. We had 6 weeks to work together on this piece. I had shot all the backgrounds and edited them as a kind of text. And I also had Warburg's text organized. What I didn't have were the movements in the space and the music. And so Jason and I worked together for 6 weeks developing that. He would play something, if I liked it or not liked it, then we would alter it. And then so we were inspired by each other. And we've been working together ever since, and in the same way, but of course that's developed. But anyway, here. And this is Jose Blondet.
I have the sensation of being a seismograph, assembled from the wooden pieces of a plant that has been transplanted from the east into the fertile northern German plains, and onto which an Italian branch was grafted. I let the signs that I received come out of me, because in this epoch of chaotic decline, even the weakest has the duty to strengthen the will to cosmic order.
So we made a large moving screen. And Jason, of course, is playing live. So the screen altered the space throughout the performance. It would go on and off the stage and be moved back and forth. Again, I'm interested in space and how to alter the space itself. I'm going to, I think the next is reanimation. Oh no, this is the last scene from this piece, and I was able to visit Dia Beacon before they renovated it and film there in the basement.
Of today is no longer afraid of the rattlesnake. He kills it. In any case, he doesn't worship it. It now faces extermination. The lightning, imprisoned in wire-captured electricity, has produced a culture with no use for paganism. What has replaced it? Natural forces are no longer seen in anthropomorphic or biomorphic guides, but rather as infinite waves obedient to human touch. These waves, the culture of the machine age, destroys the space for devotion. Telegram and telephone destroyed the cosmos. Mythical and symbolic thinking strive to form spiritual bonds between humanity and the surrounding world, shaping distance into the space required for devotion and reflection. The distance, undone by the instantaneous electric connection. What I saw unexperienced can be represented only in its outer appearance. And I have the right to speak about it only if I say first that its insoluble problematic has been suppressing a burden on my soul, that in my healthy time I never would have dared to say something scholarly about it. But now, in Kreuzlingen, in a sealed institution where I find myself a seismograph, I let the signs that I receive come out of me, because in this epoch of chaotic decline, even the weakest has the duty to strengthen the will to cosmic order.
I'm going to skip the rest of this because we don't have time, but the doors in the cellar opened at the very end of this piece and let in the light. It was a very, I'll never be able to do this piece in that way again. And Warburg walks out. But I'll just say that he's also, you know, there's also a quote, it was just before the Second World War, and Warburg saw Mussolini come into power, and then he moved his library from Hamburg to London. So this was also at a time in the 30s, similar to when HD was. This is the installation. So the way I switch from one medium, from performance to installation and back again, is I re-edit, take apart the video, and find different ways to arrange it in space so that it makes sense as a place to be in the middle of something. You're in the piece instead of watching it from the outside. And so the editing is very different. It's in the performances, actually it's slower, and sometimes in these installations it's faster. And it also includes the props, the object, the furniture. I'm now going into the next piece, Reanimation, and going back to Iceland. While I was in Iceland, I began to be interested in the writing of Halldór Laxness, who's a great writer. And I chose a piece called Under the Glacier. And part of it was shot in Norway, and I'm just showing you an image of, I didn't go to Iceland again. I went to Norway instead because I have a friend who has a house in the Lofoten Islands, A.K. Dolvin, and she invited me to go there. And her friend was Ande Sambe, who's a Sami. He's a human rights lawyer, but he's also a singer in the Sami tradition, and so he became part of my pieces. And he came to New York to record his voice. And this is Reanimation. It went through different stages. The first installation was in this house in the field of Documenta that Carol and Christoph Barkagev curated. And very seldom do I do something in coordination with a curator or in collaboration. But in this case, she had the idea to have, as some of you must have seen, to have some of the works of artists in these houses, these prefab houses, in wherever they wanted to in the park. And she gave us a choice of which house we wanted. So I chose this house. And so these are shots looking through the windows. The audience couldn't go into the house. They could only look at the piece from the outside and see the videos. There were speakers on the outside of the house. You see the drawings that are made in relation. I made this object with crystals. It became a device, an optical device in the piece, which I'm interested in doing. And these drawings are the beginnings of my Rorschach drawings that are very a major part of the piece in Venice. So these are the videos that were projected. I'll just quickly, and the windows were little stage sets with video monitors with some of the images. This is Melancholia, and so on and so forth. So that music, now it comes into all the work because I love it. And I think of something different to do with it. And it's in the Venice piece, for instance, and it's in the performance. And I'll just say that Reanimation is based on a book called Under the Glacier. And when I first began to work with this text, the first thing one thinks of, glacier, oh, they're melting. So naturally it became about the glaciers melting and about water and about the plight. He speaks in a very poetic way about birds and animals. And this particular passage is based on a little paragraph he has about the snow bunting being such an animal that is so small, so delicate, but yet it stands in the wind in a storm, and it can face into the storm and not be blown away. It's so small, but yet so strong. It's very touching, some of his writing. He's also very witty. I'll show you this. This is when I went to the Lofoten Islands. I had to finish it. This Reanimation took several years, and when I was invited to go to the Lofoten Islands, inside the Arctic Circle, that really appealed to me, to go inside the Arctic Circle. And of course, I'd like to go back. And so I went in February because, having been in Iceland in the summer, I wanted to go north when it was dark. And I found different ways to draw, like in all the pieces, but in this piece, drawing in the snow was one thing that occurred to me when I got there. I never thought of it before I went there. And then another thing I do in the performance is I pour ink on a piece of paper and I put ice on it, and I make a drawing by moving the ice around. So that, to me, in that case, it represents pollution. In this case, I simply... So this is a very complicated novel, and it's about a renegade priest. It's also very witty, but I took fragments of it, for instance. And this is Ande singing, just so you have an idea of his singing. And I think there's many aspects of Laxness that inspired me. I could go on working with his texts for a long time that carried over into the piece in Venice. It was a real segue from this piece to Venice. because Venice also has to do with the environment and nature, and it includes ghost stories from Cape Breton. I'll just read a text from Laxness about ghosts that I use in Reanimation. One can be one's own ghost and roam about in various places, sometimes many places simultaneously. Perhaps I didn't approach it quite correctly. A ghost is always the result of botched work. A ghost means an unsuccessful resurrection, a shadow of an image that has perhaps once been alive, a kind of abortion of the universe. And we're going to go through a tunnel. I might make this a little shorter. But in the Lofoten Islands are many tunnels going through the sheer rocky mountains. And you have to, you can't go around them. It's very hard. So they built many tunnels in order for people to go from even one village to another. But we'll just go a little bit into the tunnel, because it's very, I think it's magical. So I took the different tracks that Ande sung, and I edited them together to make this kind of duet with himself. And Jason only wrote music for the performance in this case. He didn't write music for the installation. All right. This is a device with the crystals and these pieces of cones that I made as an optical device for the filming, and we filmed through them. And these are, I decided later on, when I made the installation, that the house where people had to look through the windows at the video was too difficult for people to perceive really well the video. So I made, now this piece exists like this, projected on the walls of a paper, like a Japanese house. Another influence from Japan for me. And you know, it's also a framework that divides the picture into different rectangles. It's a kind of way of dealing with the image, another way of thinking of the image. And so, yeah. And just briefly, I had a big show in Milan in this hangar Bicocca, and I just wanted to include this. It's the biggest show, the biggest space I've ever been in, and I'll never have a space like this. This is before it was finished. And the projections aren't up, some of them are. But I did this right before the Venice show, and it was very much of a challenge to go from this space into the American Pavilion in Venice, which is quite claustrophobic. And this space was totally expansive and great. Okay. All right, now, I think we're going to switch to Venice. So what inspired, I made this sculpture of dead trees outside the American Pavilion. I don't want to say in words what it signifies, but it has something to do with the world and what's happening, and also the building, and maybe my feelings about being in the building. But what really inspired, so that's the way this begins, and also there are trees in the piece, in the projections, and sticks all throughout the pavilion, some of which were brought from Cape Breton. So this is one of the things that inspired me. If you are going to tell me the story of the dandelion and the honeybee, John, I shall hit you. Lyrical poetry is the most disgusting drivel on earth, not accepting theology. I'm going to bed. When a dandelion calls to a bee with its scent to give it honey, and the bee goes off with the pollen from the flower and sows it somewhere far away, that I call a supercommunion. It would be remarkable if a more supercommunion could be established, even though intergalactic communications were put in order. So I'm just going to had a theme, and there were 2 videos in each room. The video on the stage structure was the main video, and this is the bee room. There were drawings of bees. The other video dealt with the ghost stories, quoted from Cape Breton sources, ghost stories told by people probably, and collected in a publication called the Cape Breton Journal, I think. Anyway, put together by Ronald Kaplan over the years. It's a fantastic archive of oral tradition, stories that people told him about themselves. And it gives you a history of people in Cape Breton and their beliefs. So I took the ghost stories from Cape Breton. One reason was I didn't want to have literary ghost stories, and I liked the very simple language of these ghost stories. So this is the B room. I worked with children, all children of friends. I had vitrines in which I put objects because I wanted to say something. The subject matter was, in this case, bees and what is happening to bees, for instance, in the first room. And so there's an article, it's called Too Busy Bees, and then the bee dance, what do bees do? And so I was inspired by the very poetic way that Haldor Laxness writes about nature and how he makes these very simple things we take for granted, they're really miraculous, and they're disappearing. And so that was the theme. I didn't want to say it outright, of course, so I say it in different ways. And this is the bee room. These are two of the children. So I'm going to show you now one of the videos. We went to Brooklyn. We found a beekeeper in Brooklyn and I filmed these beehives there. And then this is the ghost story, part of the ghost story video in the same room.
My father used to hear voices from the other side of life. He'd go up in the forest to his space there, and he'd just sit down and talk with his own father, my grandfather, and others, other people in that world. His people. I can still speak with my father. He's a young man now. He comes with a beard now, and everything as I knew him, and then he changes to what he is, a young man. My mother the same. I borrowed a rope to take my cow to pasture, and I never gave it back. The rope is hanging on the bars. It's bothering me. You give the rope back, and you won't see me no more.
And the next room is it's called the ocean room, and or the fish room. And the fish some of the work I began a couple of years ago. I have this residency, I go to a residency program in Japan, and one produces a work there. One stays for 3 or 4 weeks and produces a work. In this case, I wanted to make 100 drawings of fish. Paintings, actually. Well, they're ink drawings. Again, I made ink drawings with a brush. I wanted to practice using a brush, working with ink, which I hadn't really explored. And I also thought about all the fish that are being eaten and so on. So this is the fish room, and this is the vitrine for the fish room. Various objects, I won't go into it, that pertain to the subject. This is a reflection in the mirror room of the fish room. So these are simply stills, some of the stills from the videos. And I'm not playing any, there's not time really to look. I'll just mention this image. It doesn't happen anymore to Cape Breton because a golf course has been built on the beach, but people used to take there's a racetrack in the town I live in, and the people take their horses down to the sea because they like to swim. And I recorded this one day, maybe 10 years ago. I really used a lot of stuff that I hadn't used before. This is the mirror room. Because I was making a piece in Venice, I wanted to work in Murano. I wanted to make something in Murano to take this opportunity. So I had mirrors made, and I made a chandelier with crystals that we collected, but mirrors that distorted the image. And then we projected through the chandelier in the mirror room. Because the idea of this was that one walks through the bee room and the fish room and then the wind room and the home room, and then one sees oneself in the mirror room. We see ourselves. The space is totally symmetrical, and I also dealt with that in the way the things were arranged. This is called the wind room, and the kites were also made in Japan a couple of years ago. The shapes were made by a traditional kite maker, and I painted them these different colors and then cut out different shapes and put on the kites. And here again is the ghost and the wind. I think there's a shot of the wind video, but I'm not sure. I'm very influenced since a child by magic shows and magicians, and I think you can see a lot of those references in my work if you look at it, and inspired by magicians are making illusions, magic tricks. This is a turbine that a friend of mine actually produced in Cape Breton. And this is the last room called the home room, because I thought of the children going to school, actually. And so there are schoolroom scenes in this room. The two girls both had long, curly hair. And so one scene was, I had them braid their hair together. That was one of the images. And so this is the homeroom. I'm going fast now because I just want to show you some clips of the performance. And these are the girls braiding hair. So we made a stage set. I had a studio in Westbeth, and we made a stage set and filmed everything there. I hired a cameraman to film because we were projecting video, and the children were performing in the video. So I'm just going to go quickly. Most of the objects you see I found in Cape Breton. So it was very strange. Here I am in Canada, but I will say that. So this is the performance, and you see, I had, except for the two girls, the children were in the performance, and it was on a rather wide stage. Jason, again, did the music, and it was all new music, because he wasn't really very much, he didn't do anything new for the installation. And so I was very interested in the way the live figures could interact with the projected figures, and how it's hard to tell the difference sometime between the foreground of the live kids and the background with the recorded kids. And I designed a screen for projection and included mirrors on the sides that were on rollers that were used. And we did very simple things with the children. Jason's playing live, by the way, of course, he always does. I had to give the children very simple tasks. They only were there for 3 days before the performance. So that was that, and then I'll just show you some scenes, and then that's it. So this is the classroom scene, and again, we won't look at the whole thing. But the classroom scene consisted of the children, some of them sitting on chairs and drawing. I had the children do what I do. That's the way I work with other people. Make drawings. They make drawings, of course. And they were drawing the animals that were being projected in the space where they were sitting. And that had a reference. Actually, I used animals from a trip I made to Vienna a long time ago and went to the Natural History Museum and filmed all the animals in that museum. It's a very interesting, I think I don't know if they've changed or not, but anyway, it's a very interesting collection. So, you know, using various devices in relation to the video. And then, this is the last image. So I found many things in Venice. One of them was this oar, which is very, very heavy. It's a prop that inspired me to do this. One lunch period, Jason and I didn't want to go out for lunch, so we both were just hanging around the stage, and I hadn't figured out what to do with the oar, so I picked up the oar, and then this is the way we worked together. He was sitting at the piano, and he started playing, and I started moving, and that's how this sequence came. Anyway, but that's it for my lecture. Thank you.
Thank you so much for this lecture, for giving us this overview over the last decades. And of course, there's probably quite a few questions that might have come up for you, the audience. And
Could they turn the lights up so we could...
Yeah, maybe can you turn on... Yeah, that would be great. Turn on the lights so there's a little more... That's great. Is there an immediate question that has to be posed or asked? Please. I know there's also microphones in the back.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It was beautiful. Just
Si vous voulez poser votre question en français, bien sûr, c'est aucun problème et on peut le traduire.
That was like a travel, like a dream, this conference. I would like to hear more about what you were talking in your work in the 60s, 70s. You were talking that during a time you were doing a work about your alter ego and your persona, and you were using some inspiration from a travel in Japan, I think.
Who?
You were inspired by a travel, and you were in those times in the feminism, working with your alter ego and persona. And I would like to hear more about this period, and how was for you that an exploration of the self. This is in one hand, and on the other hand, I was reading some article about telling that this type of work is a kind of narcissism in that period. Not your work, that the feminist work. Like it was Rosalind Krauss was writing about the narcissism in the work, in the video, in the feminist video, and in the early feminist video, and other artists that were using the video as a kind of doing the image of themselves, but like a kind of narcissism. And I would like to hear what is your opinion about that, if you know this.
Well, I'll just say
comments.
it's a long question.
Yeah, I know.
Has lots of. I'll just
well,
start.
just if it's too long, just.
No. I try to summarize it. I started working with the idea of narcissism in my mirror pieces before I started working with video, because I was interested in it. Actually, the dancers from the 60s were totally against narcissism, you know, because they were rebelling, maybe in partly Martha Graham, and they were reacting against. Dancers are very narcissistic, and I mean, there's a strong tradition of just looking at oneself in the mirror. And so when I began working with mirrors, of course the idea of narcissism comes up, and so I explored it. I like the idea that some people were made uncomfortable by it. The mirrors made people uncomfortable. People are uncomfortable at having other people see them looking at themselves in the mirrors. So when the mirrors went by people would go, you know, like this sometimes, or they would look at themselves. Anyway, so it had an interesting effect on the audience. The video camera, when it came out, when I got mine in 1970 when I went to Japan, and the video camera is a natural, it's just, narcissism is inherent in the idea of somebody sitting in front of a closed circuit video camera looking at themselves on the monitor. It just is in the technology, it's there. And so there's nothing mysterious about it. It's either, I mean, not everybody dealt with it directly, of course. I don't think Bill Wegman's work is narcissistic. There's a number of people I could mention. I don't think that Bruce Nauman is a narcissist, but his work is all about himself performing, and you could say that's narcissistic. I think that's what Rosalind Krauss is referring to, partly. I was interested as a subject to explore and also to irritate people, actually. And so my work was also very much about me looking at myself and altering my appearance. I don't know if that helps you.
Yeah, it's helped me because I think it's an answer to what is Rosalind Krauss telling, and I think video really helped to do this construction of the subject.
Yes, I think it did, definitely. I mean, I have to say that if you ask me about my personal whatever, it took years. It all takes years. It's not just in that period, anyway.
No, I just think this narcissism is like something to construct yourself.
Yes.
I wanted to hear you.
Okay.
Please.
So you were talking about how research is kind of inherent in the creative process when you're creating, but for you as an artist, I want to hear more about like how vigorously you research, or how like integral that is to your pieces. Are you doing extensive research about certain aspects, or are you inspired by something and then research it a little bit and then carry on from your
I have to say, I've been doing research since I started going to school and studying, so it's not a separate subject for me or for people in my gen. I mean, I think it's become a subject now in academia, And it's a little hard for me to deal with that, you know what I mean? Because research is a natural part of our, so when you ask me how much I do research, yes, of course. I'm researching all the time. Anybody who deals with content and subject matter, I don't call it research, I call it reading, going to the library, you know, I don't really have to call it research, if you see what I mean. But it is just an integral part of my work, as it is of many people's work. I mean, whenever I go to another country, I go to every museum. I mean, I'm just a curious person. I would say to students, curiosity, stay curious, keep learning. I call it learning, actually.
That was great, thanks. I'm really interested in the shift from performance to installation or vice versa, specifically when it comes to telling stories. And I'm wondering maybe what happens when you pull yourself out of the space, or if you either you pull yourself out or you pull other players out. Like what happens to the story in that process?
When I pull myself out, you mean when I said I don't do that?
Well, when it becomes an installation and not a performance, basically.
Well,
or
it's
like
a different form. I work very hard on that transformation. And when I first, it loses this live element, which is a very visceral, the audience has a very visceral relation to that live element. But I no longer have that as a problem, really, because I make, the video works are works in themselves. They're like films, you know? And so the person experiences the videos in a different way. They're inside of them. And I can't say what, you know, also, I only know what happens to me. I don't know what happens to the audience. I don't have any idea of how you are going to react to my pieces. And everybody reacts differently. Not radically differently, because there's the same information, but different people have different experiences. So when you say what happens, nothing happens, in a way. But then it's simply a different spatial and experience. And it's immediate in a very different way. You know, if you go to a play or a dance, you experience dance, particularly you experience it with your body kinesthetically. And that doesn't happen. On the other hand, you can see a film and be affected physically by a film, by the sound and the movement and so on. You know, I'm an artist, and I try to, I think of each medium in quite a different way. It's an overlapping, but it's also, I've been very influenced by film, for instance. I studied film just on my own by going to films, going to the Anthology Film Archive. It's a very important part of my reference, filmmaking. If I were going to teach, I would tell them, young students, you have to know about film, because it's what all this stuff comes out of, but a lot of people don't know that. And so I think it's very important to have that knowledge and to know that history and to know how the moving image has developed into what it is now. So I think of it in that way. I don't think about my body not being in it. I think of the positive things